Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Nick Marshall. I'm the head of exhibitions and programs here at George Eastman Museum. Tonight's conversation with Joshua Rashaad McFadden and Lyle Ashton Harris is in conjunction with the exhibition Joshua Rashaad McFadden, I Believe I'll Run On, which is currently on view in our main galleries through June 19. This conversation and all programming related to the exhibition have been generously sponsored by the Lipson Visiting Artist Fund. We are immensely grateful for this support that is enabling us to bring meaningful and important conversations to our community and to be able to share them more broadly online. If you haven't noticed, we are recording tonight's program. I Believe I'll Run On is an early career retrospective exhibition and book publication of Joshua Rashaad McFadden's work from the past 10 years. And it spans genres ranging from portraiture, social documentary, reportage, fine art, and the family archive. The 7 series that comprise the exhibition reveal a layered, nuanced, and poetic view of Black life in America today. Dr. Heather A. Shannon curated the selection of objects in the exhibition along with the artist, and Dr. Jared Richardson wrote the accompanying interpretive texts in the gallery. The publication, which was officially released a few days ago, we've had it in our store now a couple of weeks, it was just released, and that will be kind of the focus of tonight's conversation. The book is a beautifully illustrated survey of Joshua Rashaad's work. It includes an in-depth conversation between Joshua Rashaad and Lyle Ashton Harris. I invite you all to join us at the main galleries to see the exhibition and meet tonight's speakers for a book signing following the talk. Books are on sale in the museum's store, which is located in the Wolk Concourse as you entered the building. And that the store is right next to the cafe. We will be closing tonight at 8 p.m. So at the conclusion of the conversation, I will be taking Joshua Rashaad and Lyle out the doors behind me in order for us to get down to the gallery and set up for the book signing. So I do ask that if you'd like to speak with our speakers this evening, please wait to do so until we get down to the galleries. That way we make sure we've got plenty of time to do the book signing. Let's see here. I want to just give a little bit more about the speakers, and then I'm going to hand it over. I've already talked a little bit about Joshua Rashaad's work, and in addition to the exhibition here at the museum, Joshua Rashaad's works have been on view internationally and have been published in the New York Times, Slate Magazine, Time Magazine, and Smithsonian Magazine. And probably more since I wrote this. Currently, he is an assistant professor of photography at RIT. Lyle Ashton Harris has cultivated a diverse artistic practice that explores intersections between the personal and the political, examining the impact of ethnicity, gender, and desire on the contemporary social and cultural dynamic. He is represented in the permanent collections of renowned institutions worldwide and has been exhibited internationally, including most recently in Photography's Last Century at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and in Basquiat's Defacement, The Untold Story and Implicit Tensions. Implicit Tensions, Mapplethorpe Now at the Solomon R. Guggenheim. Harris lives and works between New York City and the Hudson Valley and is a professor of art at New York University. Please join me in welcoming Joshua Rashaad McFadden and Lyle Ashton Harris.
Well, hello.
Good evening.
Well, thank you, Nick, for that wonderful introduction and for inviting me to come here and to speak with Joshua. So it's a real honor to be here. In fact, it's my first time here in Rochester, so my first time at the museum. And I unfortunately was not able to make the opening, but I'm so grateful that I'm here this evening to spend time with you all and to see this extraordinary exhibition, which I'm sure everyone has seen. And yes, we're looking forward, I guess, to this evening. We're just gonna free fall. And I mean, let's all also give Joshua a congratulations for an extraordinary book.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks again, Nick, and to everybody for coming out tonight to, I guess, listen to us talk about the last, 8 years or so that we've kind of engaged and known each other and became friends, but also we're creating work.
Let's drill down a little bit on that, because I think it'd be good. Is that your mother that I'm seeing? Oh
Yeah,
my
that's my mom.
I assume we'll be having a more intimate moment over the weekend. I look forward to coming and actually meeting you. And Josh has met my mother. He's been connected with my family as well. So it's a real honor to see you. I'm looking forward to meeting you. I think it's just good to just start out, because in terms of specificity, we actually met in 2014. In fact, I did some cheat notes on the way up here. And it was on the occasion of me receiving the 10th annual Driscoll Prize award. You know, the great David Driscoll, the late great David Driscoll. There's an award in his honor that's at the High Museum, and I was a 10th recipient. And at the time, after the award ceremony in Atlanta, you came to the lecture the next day.
Yes.
And you
Yes.
were at that time, you were in your second year at SCAD.
Yes, in grad school.
Grad school. So I remember distinctively, meeting Josh. And it's not often that you get the opportunity to meet someone who becomes a mentor, but just to see the arc and the expansion of one's work and the unfolding. So that's a real honor. And I am grateful that I've also have had that with mentors who have gone on. And so I guess it's a testament to my own aging process, but also just the joy and just seeing how, so I'm here to celebrate, just to see this unfolding and this magnification, particularly at this moment. I think we should also somehow say that a few years ago, on the eve, the day after George Floyd was killed, Josh and I were on the phone, and within 24 hours, he had traveled by car to Minneapolis.
Minneapolis, yes.
And I think it's also important to somehow say, although the magazines and press came later in terms of coverage, I think it's important to talk about the idea, the sacrificial, that it was I want you to talk about, because it wasn't about Vanity Fair or the New York Times or whatever, the Washington Post, that was having you come to go document. You went out of almost an incessant need to go. And so I just want to I think it's important to talk about that we, in a way, are witnessing, if you go to the galleries, someone who was able, through the heart chakra, to be open to what was possible and to reframe another narrative. So I think it's important to take us back to that moment, that site of why you went there, as a way just to sort of give a different context, for the work. I think it's important to talk about that.
Sure. Yeah.
Take your time.
I guess to begin talking about that, we'd have to go back to 2017, or actually 2016, 2017. And we were actually both in New York City doing a conversation for Come to Selfhood.
Of course.
And that summer was when Philando Castile was murdered by police, also in Minnesota. And so I documented protests in New York City immediately. We remember hearing protests just happening right in New York City outside your apartment. And so experiencing those protests in New York City that year, I don't know, I almost felt like a sense of hopelessness kind of slipping in that moment, because it was actually two men killed a day after each other that week, on social media by police officers. And so at that moment, after that protest, I said, you know what, I think I'm going to begin to photograph these things in a different way. I wasn't sure if I was going to continue to participate in the protest. And you remember we talked about that. And we talked about mental health, what is protest actually doing? And if you all can remember at that time, it wasn't like Black Lives Matter was being as widely supported as it is now, right? And so at that time, we saw rebuttals to Black Lives Matter, which was the cry of all lives matter, and arguing why are people saying this? Why are people saying Black Lives Matter? That was the conversation at that time. So if you can imagine what the activists felt participating in those protests at that time. And also, right, it was in election time, right? So it was also Trump era. So moving forward, I started to do other projects like Evidence. I started to just dive more into my studio practice, portraiture, and engaging photography in a different way rather than protest photography.
But I would also say in
yeah.
the beginning, because I would argue the fact a project like Come to Selfhood from 15 or Selfhood 2016, in a way, in terms of your exploration of Black male youth identity in all its complexity, in a way made it right for you to actually even feel more deeply the trauma of that experience. Because I think it's important to say, although some of the work falls under the category of documentary photography, etc., that I think its essence is rooted in a multiplicity of experiences. I think it's important to talk about that. I'm drawn to the part of you that compelled. I just need to say, like, I was not on the road. It's also, we have to remember, this was deep COVID in terms of, like, I am of the age where I'm 57. So, and it was also, just to think about, I was not on the road. So what it meant for somehow your generation in terms of occupying the street, being out there, occupying the bodies. And for me, I don't know, I just sort of feel like that it speaks to the deep level of empathy in a way that was so happening not only nationally, but as you said, through BLM had actually spread like wildfire. In fact, from Paris, to London, to Rome, to the protests, I believe in parts of Africa as well. So but I am interested how, for me, so much is rooted in the part of you that was trying, not only tried, but was languaging photographically a different modality of how do you represent Blackness, youth. Does that make any sense? So I think in a way that there's something about that, the fleshing out of that. So of that, you using the medium photography to give voice and to flesh out and to give other modalities of what might be possible, if that makes any sense. So
definitely. And that's what creating those projects in between 2016 and 2020 helped me do, right? The Evidence, the traveling, starting at Morehouse College, going to Tennessee, and asking and questioning people, what do they think about freedom in 2017? What does it mean to them? What is the masculinity and identity? How do they identify in a country that does not support the whole being of African Americans at all, right? And so that kind of helped me discover where people in my generation were as far as all of these things that were happening and that are happening right now. And we see, right now, what has come out of the last 10 years. And so going back.
Let's talk about that.
So
from your perspective, what do you
Yeah.
think? Yeah.
Well, I think so. Well, to answer your question, when it came to 2019 going into 2020, when we found ourselves in a pandemic, we just opened the show Evidence at Visual Studies Workshop, which was the result of all of those years of interviewing people. And that show only stayed open for about two weeks before we were shut down. So we're in lockdown. We didn't have class, we weren't teaching. Then we started class, but online. And we just weren't sure where we were. And then George Floyd happens. The event happened to where he's murdered by police officers, and we all have to reckon with it, and we see it. And we see it even more because we're at home. We had no choice but to see it. We couldn't ignore it. Nobody could. And then we talked. I spoke to you. I spoke to one of my best friends, Corey. Spoke to my little brothers. And that moment, it did feel different for me. I think it felt different for a lot of us. And one morning, I guess the next morning after we spoke, I meditated and I left. I literally just got in the car and I left. I packed a bag, not enough of anything. I made sure I had my camera. And, and I left. I didn't know how long I was going to end up staying, but I ended up pretty much staying for months. And then end up photographing there for over a year.
It was a couple of years, wasn't it?
Almost two.
Yeah.
Almost two. So it was a feeling of kind of knowing that it was my calling, that I had to be there. I was called back to that work, not by publishers and not by editors, but it was more of a higher calling,
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Because
No, I definitely you feel that, and I feel that, and I definitely see that in the work, particularly. And we would talk often while Josh was on the road. And remember one time he was gassed and sort of like, and I'm into metaphysical stuff in terms of like going and getting food, encouraging him to make sure he eats certain types of food, or taking a bath, or just trying to somehow find some sort of way to protect oneself, while in the fields, and war zone, and So and I mean, as someone, and as you know, you're also close with my brother, from filmmaker Thomas Allen Harris, in terms of like, in a way, you were our direct link to what was actually happening in terms of, let's say, in that part of the world, that part of the country, and. So I don't know. I just sort of feel like I don't think it can be overstated how. I mean, as you said, so many things have shifted radically, because I think it's also important to talk about that in terms of what has happened over the last couple of years in terms of, because I almost feel, I live in New York, I'm at NYU, and I'm just thinking about the possibility over the last 2 years in terms of a deep, certain sense of empathy that was. I mean, this is, as we know, the largest social justice. As Angela Davis and Cornel West said, they would not have ever had imagined that they would be in this place, where we'd be in this place we're right now. And it was collective. It was in terms of people coming together from all different, races, identities, sexualities, et cetera. And for once, those quote unquote divisions were laid down for a larger collective, somehow, resistance. And what I love about the work, and it's so deeply moving, is that it would be very easy not to have that documentation. And that's the power, the incendiary power of photography. The fact that if you look at the memorial site, I think is George Floyd 1, and just, I mean, within the week that the protest was actually done, just thinking about what it meant to, I mean, if you think about the trials and you think about, you hear the people talking, I mean, even that liminal space of being on the sidewalk and not being able to come within 2 feet. and what that meant for them to, all of us, to experience that level of trauma. But the fact that you were actually there, you had in the process of experiencing and documenting the unfolding of that, and also the scene of the crime, but also the scene of like grief and the scene of like mourning and melancholy, or mourning and militancy, and to be occupying spaces, etc. And so we're left with the residue in terms of, so the photography, for me, it's and that's how I think of photography. In a certain sense, there is the experiential, but it's also the residue. So when I encountered that photograph, I obviously had seen the book, but when I encountered memorial site number 1, it was like, it transported me back to that moment within a week of the 7 minutes. I mean, just think about it. And a lot of people did not see that. We read about it. But I would tell students, I need for you to actually to look and to see and to experiencing, just thinking about how that ignited and cracked open our hearts and our minds to leap beyond. And I think you were there and witnessing and documenting. And I think the book, without question, captures, the essence of that. So, I just want to acknowledge that. I think, it cannot be overstated, just, again, the idea of the sacrificial and what that actually meant to be in the road. And I've had my own road trips. I've done that, over the decades. But it was
Right.
something about, that, yes, Angela Davis and Cornel West said they can never have imagined the fact that they were inspired by this next generation to be able to embody that. So, and the book captures that for me, the work.
Yeah, thank you. I was just in Boston actually last week. I think I told you that, right? In Boston,
Yes, yeah, you
at the history conference, and
yes.
speaking about history of protest photography, and I think there was a question. There was a question about the common things that you would see in protest images throughout time. They kind of framed it as tropes, but I had to say I wouldn't necessarily use the word trope, right? I would say there's actually a history of activism, a history of protest, and things that are passed down through lineages.
Yes.
As far as what would occur during a protest, right? And I think that from Diane, the staging of the Dianes. You'll see that from the Black Power fist here, right? This is actually the image they were talking about. And so, Black Power fist, et cetera, et cetera. And, I said, to say that it was a trope that people are holding up that Black Power fist was incorrect, right? That is something that that has been passed down to where we know that is a symbol of pride, right? And that's something that we continue to see at protests if we go back to the 60s up until now. And so to see that there's power in that, power within that, and so to hear, who were you saying? Cornel West.
Even before that, what is it during is it 32 Olympics?
Right.
Who am I referencing in terms of who was the? It's a 32 was the. Thank you. And what year was that? 39. Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. 39. Yeah. So.
Okay. Right.
Yeah, so even
exactly,
okay.
in the powerful
Thank you.
photograph. Thank you. Right.
It takes a village.
Right. But to see that, and to have the tool of the camera, to capture that, and that really is what shows, the power within that. And so I think what you're saying is when people say, they can't believe that the young people have, just kind of picked up where others have left off. It seems shocking, but actually it makes sense. Yeah. Because it has, this idea has of protest and the actions and the demands, they have been passed down and they have been, let's say, handed off.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, it makes me think of, I appreciate that, because it makes me think of a show at the school, Jack Shaman, on Black Power, and looking at, and I even posted these images of Angela Davis, and then George Jackson, and just seeing, just the deep intelligence in terms of him also trying to create a movement that was not maybe it wasn't post-racial, but in terms of like connecting different fractions, black, white, Latino, etc. And ultimately that was like deeply threatening. But just to seeing the residue of those, seeing the photographs and just seeing this embodiment of this young revolutionary, and it's through the photograph, it's through the image that actually documents and captures, which is important.
Yeah, I think that's what we see here, right? The young baby here holding up their fist with their mother holding.
I was just thinking the photograph of the one of the police, the one I want, and I can't but help think of Baldwin's commentary on the black police, the black police officer within the black community, and the contradictions, around that.
Yeah, and this is actually named. I thought of Basquiat in the painting, irony of the Negro policeman, and I called this, irony of the black policeman. What is the role of the black police officer within the black community? And this moment was very intense. This is in Atlanta, Georgia, and I remember it moving all around, I guess, this moment. And you'll see protesters actually speaking to this police officer, asking, things like, how could you stand by? This is after Rashad Brooks was killed by police officers in Atlanta, Georgia, in a Wendy's parking lot, and it captured on camera, et cetera. And so then you see, black police officers like blocking off protesters. And so what is that conflict? And,
Can you talk about, I want to just pivot a little bit, if you could talk a little bit about community, because I would argue that there is the idea of struggles that may come from outside the body in terms of how you may perceive from outside. But I'm also interested in terms of how photography's relationship to healing oneself. And I'm just, without, overstepping bounds, but just thinking about, and I'm really happy you're here at RIT, and it's a blessing to have you. And I want to just acknowledge all the tremendous work you've been doing, and because you're assistant professor, and you've been on the road. You've been showing up.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about, you had a very different experience of, let's say, in the South at a university, and because I'm interested in terms of like how you have used photography to heal the wounds that one might have encountered both within and out of community, if that makes any sense, and how. So I'm just also thinking about in terms of what it means to the solitude on the road or the solitude within the studio, and how photography, or the way I see the early work, all the work actually runs through, for me, is creating multiple platforms of community. And I'm just thinking of like being in the South and having that experience when a student, said something racially inappropriate to you as you were teaching. And and what it took for me not to actually come down, not to come, come down there, get my colleague and dear friend Deb Brillis, but it's sort of like, and I'm just interested because I've had my own experiences in different type of ways, and how that fuels the work. And I think in a way that one almost in an alchemic way takes that and actually creates a more expansive way of being in the world, and through that one is able to be open to be broken, but also open up to more possibility and more joy and more giving and more witnessing, etc.
Yeah. It's I've lived in the South for over 10 years. I did undergrad in North Carolina at small HBCU, Elizabeth City State University, and so. Leaving Rochester, New York, to go there and experiencing the South and living there for not experiencing the South for the first time, but actually living there for a long period of time for the first time, and starting to experience things more abrupt, like racism, more outwardly. You know, being stopped by police, pulled out of the car, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. For context, this is 2012, right? Also, same year, Trayvon Martin was killed, okay? So just to put that on a timeline for you all. And so just experiencing that, having my first car, but now having to now deal with being pulled out of police cars multiple times. And so it's not, you know, that the incident in Atlanta, in Georgia, was not the first time experiencing, let's say, racism, but to be, let's say, in a job now, so being a professor at a university, I'll say, in the South, and then having, you know, a white student say the N-word in my class as a challenge, right? And now it's on me to figure out, well, what is he gonna do? How is he gonna react, right? And if you look just on the news in that time period, this was happening at universities across the South, okay? Student groups would organize these things. I'm not saying if I know that's what happened in my class, right? I don't know if that's what happened, but I do know that students would use the N-word in classes where there were black professors in order to start trouble, right? There were instances where students would use the N-word in sports teams, right? And then it's really up to the students to protest against it, and then that's how results would happen, right? But now I find myself in a classroom and this thing happens, where I had to deal with a situation I've never dealt with before, because now I'm employed, right? In this respectable position. And the result was receiving a letter saying that word caused no disruption in my class, where I know that there were other black students in the class that wanted to possibly do something about the students saying that, right? And I have to kind of navigate that. Wow. But and then receiving a letter from administration saying there was no conflict. That word, it's freedom of speech, yada, 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 yada. Mm-hmm. Needless to say, I'm not there anymore. But the thing is, what do we do in those situations? And I remember talking to you and talking to Deb, and there, there was a moment of saying, well, you need to put it in the work. And so that's what I did. And that was at the same time that I was photographing a story for Smithsonian Magazine, I Am a Man. And I was going from Atlanta to Tennessee to photograph the sanitation workers who participated in the sanitation worker strike.
How did that come about, that project?
My editor, Jeff, at Smithsonian, saw the work that I was doing with Come to Selfhood, and then also the work that I was doing that is now called Evidence. Mm-hmm. And he said, I think you may be interested, in this. And so I did a bit of research, and it aligned with my ideas and the work that I did.
I love that, because I had a similar experience. When I did my first show at Jack Tolton Gala in '94, Kathy Ryan of the New York Times, become a good friend. She invited me to shoot my first cover story for the New York Times, and it was in Cabrini Green. Cabrini Green is no longer in existence, but this was at the height of the crack epidemic. And I remember the editor at the time. It wasn't Kathy; it was someone else. She was over the magazine, but someone else whose name will remain nameless. She says, well, the two kids the kids were conceived on crack. So it was all this whole narrative. And I said, well, and I remember saying to Bell Hooks, the late Bell Hooks was a dear friend, should I go or not? Because I don't want to be, I grew up, my parents were educated, and I was always critically aware. My grandfather was a race man, of how certain stereotypes that exists within journalism about black folks or poor people, etc. So I didn't want to go there and perpetuate stereotypes. So I remember when I shot Marianne Moore with a turkey on the cover of the New York Times, they were shocked 'cause there was something noble. And I think about your image of Higginbottom. There's something noble, and it's a choice how you choose to frame the figure. So I think it's important to think about how one is choosing to engage the subject. I mean, that's what I get from the work. I can read into that there's a deep compassion, and the fact that it's almost the collaborative aspect. And then I know with Marianne Moore that I could have easily gotten the two kids and the roaches at X, Y, and Z to fill that corner, but how do you bring in an element of nobility, or how do you not bring it in, how do you almost tap into the nobility within the subject itself? And I'm thinking of, let's say, one of my favorite photographs of yours is Brianna's Four Girlfriends. I mean, that's like, we all know the image at the, where is that the shore? It's at the...
It's right on the water, by
and,
the bridge. Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's so freaking ghostly. I mean, it so has such deep presence. But just to think about, it makes it even much more powerful to think about, oh, this enfleshes the woman who was killed, and just to see the experience of these four warriors, you know, who were witness, and these were her friends. That's who she did church with, you know, who broke bread with, got their nails done together.
Yeah, yes.
So, very beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, I mean, that's very important for me. I know that the camera has been used as a weapon against us for so long, right, with images that can be so, not can be, but are so degrading, and how journalism can be used to degrade so much. And
it's a choice.
And it's a choice. Like, photographers have choices to do that. Everything you see in an image, there's a choice behind that, right? And where you point the camera. Mm-hmm. But then there's also a choice, right, when you have the editors who make the selections. There's choices. There's choices here. So everything that you see that is published, there's a choice behind that. It doesn't just happen. So I think that, for examples like the, Higginbottom and Higginbotham, the family, you're talking about the man whose father was lynched in Mississippi. And I had to go to Mississippi and meet the family. Lynched in Mississippi in the 1800s. And then the son, it was now, in his 90s, and was an infant when his father was murdered. And so never really met his father. And he talked about growing up without a father, but also knowing later in life that, his mother had to flee Mississippi, flee their hometown, and just live with that trauma for the rest of her life. And so how do I go in and photograph, but also still capture that pride that he has? And that's what I seek to do, always.
I think I would be remiss if I did not talk a little bit about Love Without Justice, because what I find so strong about the installation and the book is that there are very few photographers who are able to somehow, and Carrie Mae Weems being one of them, who are able to have that strong social repertoire, but at the same time it's not a risque, but to somehow almost to show a softer side, and to have the viewer have to do that extra level of work in a way. The fact that it once is highly personal, it's intimate, it's erotic at the same time. And I think the essay, the brilliant essay by Charles Ward, he talks about that, how in referencing Tina Camp or Lee, the other critic he references, is the fact that is in fleshing Black life, the fact that it would have been very easy just to have images of protest, but the fact that you have softer sides, have more intimate sides, and what does it mean that one has to experience the embodiment, the fullness of that experience, if that makes any sense. And so I just want to get, I mean, I'm not asking if you want to respond if you like, but I find that very, it does something to me in terms of experiencing, because it triggers different modalities for me. It triggers different sensory part of me that is deeply compassionate. For example, the George Floyd, let's say the image of the memorial, and then to see you, I believe in France, or one in Martinique. I mean, just to see these very solitary, and to think, oh, it's the same subject who is at once deeply in the process of witnessing and putting oneself on the line. At the same time, there's also a showing and languaging and fleshing and modeling, the necessity for the healing of oneself as well. And I think one of the things that's come out of the BLM movement in the last couple of years, the fact that we have to learn how to rest, because we will always engage in labor. And the fact that everyone cannot be on the front line, because that produces a high blood pressure. In terms of the fact that the images in a way talk about, well, how does one have repose? How does one find different ways of somehow, different modalities of actually being? And that you could occupy but also you can model, or to language, or to flesh out, or to give voice to, that one could occupy multiple positions. That one almost has to come back to the body, to the family, to heal. Yes. To engage the family archive, and to expand what the archive is.
Yes. With Love Without Justice, which is probably, well, I feel like all of my work is, extremely, extremely personal. But now this project here is diving into, I guess, like my personal life. And it's not necessarily a project that, how you just you say, I'm going to start a project. This is a project that's been ongoing, right? I'd make an image and save it, collecting the archive, that takes years, going back and mining the archive. When I'm talking about the archive, I'm talking about the family photograph, the personal archive and the family archive, and placing importance within that. And so here you see, Everything Must Change, which is, what remained of my grandmother's wall of photos, which we're so familiar with. Here we have it here. And this is actually a photo I made in, I don't know, probably like 2010 or earlier, maybe 2007, maybe. And so I was 17. But I found it so interesting when I went back to look through these negatives, that I just made this photo with nobody in it. So there was something that I found fascinating about that wall, and I made this photo, and I was thinking about it in high school, like, oh, that's an amazing wall. I'm just gonna photograph this with my point and shoot. And I rediscovered this image as I was on the road documenting the protest. No, this was on film.
So then how did you rediscover it?
Me and my studio assistant, Lewis, we were going through, former studio assistant Lewis, were going through my archive and scanning hundreds of images that I made since I was in middle school, maybe. No, even younger, since I was 7 years old. So you'll see some images there, like Polaroids that I was making since my mother bought me a camera at age 7. And I started to look back at those, and I started to see the connections between those images from 1997 to right now. And this is one of them. And it was that I was interested in the family archive even back then. And it was something that brought me joy. It was something that I could go to and remember, not only where I came from, but also the possibilities and what I guess what this wall meant. It was a wall of pride. It was a proud. It was like Deb says, it's the museum and the Black family's home. It's a wall of our family history. And so to move forward, moving forward in that, I started to recognize like who I was back then, this child with a sense of joy, a sense of pride, and I started to think about like, well, how can I return to that? Sure.
And can we go back?
To which?
The one, the family, the wall.
Yeah.
I have similar photographs. My grandfather he was an economist at the Port Authority, but my brother and I inherited over 3,000 Etricone images from him. And, video, film, whatever was state-of-the-art at the technology at the time. And I would also say, for me, how, as a young, precocious, also queer kid in my family, how not only I saw it as a site of pride, but how was I going to carve my way into that? So I'm interested in photography as a way that photography as a way to that there's an element of difference. Now, my family accepted me. I felt alienated, outside the family in a lot of ways because of difference, whatever. But what it meant for me as a young African-American, queer, precocious kid, that I'm actually going to use the act of shooting within the family or the Black Popular Culture Conference, all these conferences, and have that be the archive, to somehow to make myself central to that archive. So I think it's important. I think that it is about being proud, but it's also about what we, or what I'm going to let you talk for your own self, say, well, there is a certain legacy of the Black family archive, but Baldwin's about creating his space with the centrality of his narrative within that. So I would even say there is that as well, what that means, to see that, okay, well, where do I fit in? I don't have kids. I'm not saying I can't have kids because I'm queer. A lot of my queer friends have kids, but the point being at that time, how photography became a way to, I'm gonna create. So when my uncle, my cousin, who's in his late 80s, who inherited a cane that was given to my great-grandfather by the governor of New York, Rockefeller at the time, I had never had imagined that I would be the one who received that. So I would argue that you are a different generation I am, but that you are actually, it's about being proud, but it's also about being the keeper of the legacy. And that's part of the experience as well. So I'm just saying that's a rhetorical question. I'm just saying, I would argue that is part of this right here. This is part of the essence of that as well. Part of the essence.
Definitely.
Because you were on at the protest, getting gassed, and someone made a comment about your pants while on the road. So I want to just sort of say what that actually meant, to be witness, to be out there, and then there's a commentary making because they might read something different about you than the next photographer, etc. So I want to just sort of say that that's part of the fiery and part of the being a young kid and seeing yourself, me saw this legacy in this family.
Yeah.
It was also, where am I in that? And not only will you position yourself, but you also are the keeper of the archive. You're not the oldest child, are you?
No.
Yeah. So, but you are in terms of the archive, in
Well,
terms
yeah.
of respectability, in terms of, let's say, what it means to go out and to document, to be present and claim space.
Well, I think that if we back up, it was, I guess, a point of discovery for me, right? Really, with the rest of my work, let's say with Come to Selfhood and Evidence, I was discovering a sense of community through that work, as far as learning where I would. Well, no, let's say discovering, I guess, where my generation fit into this new in this new context of living as Black men, living as just young Black people, but also queer. And I wasn't sure where that was. And so I guess I didn't really have the language for it. And I kind of still don't, which I think is okay.
Yeah, of course. But I love the fact that you created community and also a multiplicity.
Well, I think it's creating community and it's continuing, right? So I can't say that it's necessarily done.
Oh, definitely. Tell us about Come to Selfhood. I mean, how did you find selfhood? How would you describe those works?
I started that in, 2016?
And how did you find the subjects? I mean, how did you...
They were, it started with friends, people I knew. I was in school at the time, so a lot of students were in the project. And then it just kind of caught on, like it was friends of friends, people I would meet randomly, and I would ask if they wanted to participate in the project.
And what was the whole process for them accessing the photographs of their fathers? I mean, how?
Well, I would ask them if they wanted to participate and tell them what, the project entailed, which is including a photograph of their father, but not just a digital image, but a older image, archival image of their father from when they were in their late teens, early 20s. And so that would cause them to, or force them really to have to dig for that image. And so they would either have to ask their parents, where is it? And then their parents would ask, oh, why are you looking for an old image of me? Yeah. And so it caused, this conversation to happen.
Between the father
and the son.
I love that.
Mm-hmm.
And so with the writing, I mean, did you give them a prompt, or how did that work? I mean, because the writing section is so vulnerable.
Yeah, the writing is, well, it's less of a prompt for Come to Selfhood. The prompt was more so with evidence. They completed a sort of a questionnaire that consisted of 5 questions. And what you see here, the text or the writing underneath is the answer to those questions.
And they would write it out.
And they write it out, and I would scan it in. Mm-hmm.
And did they come back? What would they say after? What were the experiences?
Many different experiences. A lot of them said that they've never been asked these types of questions before, which is interesting because they're such personal questions. They're questions about like who do you think you would be without mentors in your life, or what does masculinity mean for you today? Things like that.
Fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what are you shooting with? I mean, these days, and what can we get into a little technical?
Look, I use a Fuji GFX camera right now, but then I was using phase 1 or a Canon. It didn't really matter. Yeah.
And I was a little jealous. We went on, we took a trip together to South America, and he had your serious camera, which was amazing. I had my little Nikon FM2, trusty. But.
Oh yeah, I usually use a big camera nowadays.
So did we want to open it for questions, or?
Sure, I'm gonna have to steal one of your.
Of course, yes.
The freshest battery one. Are there any questions?
I'm sure there must be questions.
I would love to hear Joshua talk about being on the other side of the lens. When you're a photographer, you're sort of the implied presence. And so your presence at the protests, is documented by you being behind the camera. The photographs where you are in the photographs, talk a little bit about your experience with being on the other side of the lens.
Well, I mean, I guess those are self-portraits, right? So that's different. That's different than just being on the other side of the lens, because that's an act of making a portrait of myself. And so it's really being vulnerable with the self and kind of just being comfortable with that, more so than being vulnerable with someone else when they're making your portrait. And so, that's what I grappled with making those portraits.
Question right here. I'm going to pass the mic down to you.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I just wanted to know for each person, which story had the biggest emotional impact on you and why?
Which story?
Yes.
Like from here? Or
It
what do you
can be
mean, which
from
story?
here, but it can be from any of your works, because I know that you both have had such extensive careers.
Well, I think they've all had, pretty significant impact on my life. They all kind of build off of one another. But more recently, I photographed a story for New York Magazine, and it was a story that commemorated the 10 years of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I photographed Sabrina Fulton, Trayvon Martin's mother. And so I was able to spend some time with her and talk with her, not only about what she is doing now, but that moment and how that changed her life, when her son was killed, murdered. And so, I think that one is still sticking with me for right now. It was definitely a full circle moment for me, just being a young person when that moment happened 10 years ago. I was a senior in college. About to graduate, and then that happened, and it kind of changed our generation's kind of thought about living in this country. I was 21, never really had participated in any protest, and I think that was probably one of the more significant murders of a young black person since Rodney King, or police. Highly publicized events, right? Violent events against a black person since Rodney King. And so just to be in that moment with his mother 10 years later was a big moment for me. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, should I? That's a wonderful. What's your name? Woman who asked a question. Young woman who asked a question. What's your name? Carolyn. Carolyn. That's a very pretty name, and also very wonderful question. I live with a photograph. I split my time between Hudson Valley and the city, and I live with a photograph of that I took of bell hooks and Marlon Riggs, the late bell hooks and the late Marlon Riggs. As you know, bell hooks are a famous writer. Marlon Riggs was the youngest tenured professor in Berkeley's history, seminal filmmaker. And I was sharing with Nick that in terms of, before we were discussing in terms of the intergenerational stuff, because I was Josh's age when I was actually young and precocious and going to these conferences, maybe a little younger, and meeting people. And it was a way, using photography as a way to connect with people. That was my way to get into places that maybe I was too young. And it is interesting that just a passage of time. So when Bell died a few months ago, the New Yorker published that photograph, but it just made me think about those intimate moments. And I think in a way, that's what I was, in terms of talking about Josh's archive, because there's images which are more public, but I'm also interested in those spaces. And I think that in the essay, several quotes that talk about that, the interior space of intimacy. We know the public image of bell hooks. If you think about on the cover of the New York Times, I don't know, maybe in the early 90s when I was in grad school, the black public intellectual. So we know what they look like. But what does it mean to have people engage in reverie or eating or her kissing Marley on the cheek? It's those moments that I think capture something and that have left a lasting impression on me. Even like Marlon Riggs, he died at the age of 37. And to think about that type of, imagine having left a foundational legacy, and posthumous has been honored. And so I'm interested in those moments, although now a couple of decades old, they still linger. And I think the photographs capture that and they transport. So I would say those experiences are what stay with me, I would say.
We have time for one more question.
We can take
Okay, we'll take two. We'll take two.
last three.
Hello. So I can definitely relate to the feeling of that higher calling to document the Black experience, especially in today's world. And so my question for you, Joshua, is how do you deal with the grief of the trauma that you expose yourself to on the road, on the protests? And also, how does that grief inform the work that you are doing and continue to do?
Excellent question.
How to deal with the grief?
My sense is asking, how do you deal with it? What does it mean? What is a day in life like to go out and photograph? I mean, you're crying when you come home, or you're taking a bath. I mean, all the stuff we spoke about. I mean, how does one, and then also how does it inform the work? Because you were witness on the road for 2 years. I mean, there's a public part of you, but what does that mean? I mean, what's the drive? Why doesn't one just turn back around and, for one, how many people who were not witnessing were witnessing through the paper? Or how many millions of people were witnessing as opposed to being front in line? And what is that experience like for you?
I don't think I've dealt with it. I don't think I have dealt with the grief. I think it goes beyond the eating and the taking the bath and all of that. That was happening. I think in that moment, it was important to do, but I don't think I've dealt with it. I don't think any of us have. Have we? Okay. So I get. I think when that question is kind of asked it gets asked every time, and I think just because the work is the result of doing what I felt I needed to do doesn't mean I've dealt with the grief.
Well, the book also addresses that.
Yeah.
Because of the idea of compounded mourning, compounding, and how. And I would argue the fact that just by being in your presence, that clearly there is a process. You are processing it. I mean, just one doesn't produce a volume. One does not produce the first 10 years of work with a book published by Yale. I mean, you're working through something. When we know you could come down, I rarely take a train in the city, but I took the train a couple days ago, and there's a lot of unprocessed grief and trauma. So I think to the question is whether that's the connection through the family, through the work, through your students, through teaching, through the act of making work, through creating such a phenomenal exhibition where your collaboration with the institution, that's the working through. Now, there will always be stuff that you will have to work through. The fact that you don't make that kind of work. So I think clearly there's still healing as a country, as a globe. I mean, just thinking about what's happening right now in terms of watching the news. I'm in the rebel. I understand what it means to witness that. So, and one never really gets through that. But I would affirm the part of you that is working, and the act of is part of working through the grief. So I just want to I'm not asking you to respond to that, but this is the legacy. If you were not, God forbid, here tomorrow, this is a testimony to a particular chapter in our histories and our lives collectively. And this is a deeply important document. So that is part of the work.
We have a question here.
Good evening. You spoke a little bit about an officer and how he's questioned about, like, why are you here, and like things like that. I personally connected, and I wanted you to speak on that a little bit more. Being a correctional officer at a state facility, I get questioned that every single day. And I decided that I wanted to go back to school. And I'm currently at Empire State College. And I was watching, gotta stay with me. I was watching like the Avengers, and I'm like, man, what is my superpower? So I wanted my superpower to be to change or have a different conversation about like culture and how to change the mindset of people who feel like they're supposed to be incarcerated. They're supposed to sell drugs, or they're supposed to have limited to, I can only make it to the 9th grade, or I can only do certain things. And with life, it's limitless, and it's like space. It's infinite. So I guess my question would be like, how do we, and this is the $1 million question, how do we as black men or white men or tall men, short men, any mankind, how do we change that narrative or change that mindset to thinking that we are only designed to do or be a certain thing? How do you feel?
That's a big question. I think, and I can only speak from my own experience, from number one, I guess following what my passion is, and number two, teaching people, and seeing young people follow their passion. And so it's kind of like the cycle of knowing that hadn't I stayed on the track with knowing like what I wanted to do, which was be an artist, and my mother can tell you that that's always what I've wanted to do, even when, you talked about like queer child, even when I was made fun of or beat up because of what I wanted to do, right? I stayed on that track. I stayed on that path, and that's what led me here. And I think that is what keeps me in it. It's not anything else, actually. That keeps me on this track, like making this work. I think that I owe it to myself to stay true to what I know and what I know I wanted to do and what I have been doing. Now, I guess, is to answer your question, it's really up to you to, I think, follow that path. I think you've started. I think you've questioned yourself, and you obviously know what you want to do. And that's what you should do, whatever that is. What are you studying? Education. Okay, there you have it, right? And so I think that's really all it entails. I mean, would you have anything to add to that? I think there's a lot of times where we kind of get caught in feeling like you have to take another path because of whatever reason. Yeah.
I mean, just to echo what you're saying, I mean, thank you for we appreciate what you're saying. I think and support you in that leap of faith in terms of like, because what you said is not just prisoners affected, but people who are prison guards. The film, the award-winning filmmaker, MacArthur-winning, we did on Addison, Atticus. Who am I thinking of? It's on PBS now. Attica, excuse me. filmmaker? Okay. Anyway, talks about how not only prisoners but also guards were also killed as well. So that was such a teachable moment in terms of, let's say, so I support you in terms of, let's say, finding your calling, you know, and to lean into that. So yeah. So thank you, Stanley, the great Stanley Nelson. Yes. Brain fog. One more question, or
I think we have to get down to the
okay,
galleries.
great.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, everyone, for coming
Thank
out, and
you,
let's thank
Joshua
Josh
and Lyle.
for Joshua.
Thank you all for being here. The books, like I said, the bookstore is open if you'd like to purchase a copy of the book. And then we'll be down outside of the gallery. Come and see us and say hello. And thank you for bearing with us through all the technical things.